Welcome to Dr. Warrick's podcast channel. Warrick is a practicing cardiologist and author with a passion for improving care by helping patients understand their heart health through education. Warrick believes educated patients get the best health care. Discover and understand the latest approaches and technology in heart care and how this might apply to you or someone you love.
Hi, I'm Dr. Warrick and I'd like to welcome you to my consulting room. Today I'd like to talk to you about a patient who has atrial fibrillation. Peter is a 65-year-old man who I literally saw just today, and his type of atrial fibrillation was the sort that was found completely incidentally. About a week or so ago, Peter was lining up for a routine colonoscopy, which is a check of his lower bowel to see if there was any evidence of malignancy. During that examination, while the anaesthetist was looking after him, the patient was found to be in an irregular heart rate. The ECG and subsequent monitoring confirmed that he was in atrial fibrillation. Turns out the patient had no clue he was in atrial fibrillation. He had nothing in the way of symptoms, and this is not entirely uncommon. A number of people do walk around with what we would call a cold or asymptomatic atrial fibrillation. When I spoke with the patient, it turns out that he saw his GP probably 3 months ago and his blood pressure and pulse were checked then. Everything apparently was okay at that stage. This would probably suggest that Peter has gone into atrial fibrillation in that intervening period of time. Peter's other health includes a little bit of hypertension, for which he was on therapy. He also has a bit of central adiposity and doesn't exercise a lot, and central adiposity just means the weight that you put around your belly preferentially. This can be a marker of pre-diabetes, and it is worth keeping in mind. When we looked at Peter's risk of a stroke on the CHA2DS2-VASc score, he had a score of 2. He scored 1 for age and 1 for hypertension, but in the back of my mind I would have added an extra score for pre-diabetes. With a score of 2, his risk of stroke is considered mild to moderate, and the indications from the CHA2DS2-VASc score are that he should be on full anticoagulation. Well, I commenced him on full anticoagulation from the consultation today. We also had some other information available. We had a 24-hour heart rate monitor, and this showed us that in the asymptomatic state, on average, this patient's heartbeat was beating at nearly 100 beats a minute. It went up as high as 180 beats a minute at times of exertion. For a gentleman who's in his mid-60s, that's a very fast heartbeat, and I have to admit I was quite surprised that he was asymptomatic. With that information, one of the next things I did was to add in a drug to try and slow that heartbeat down. Because if we can do that, I'm pretty sure we'll give him a little bit more puff, because it will allow his heart to work a bit better. A heart that's revving so fast just doesn't fill properly and therefore doesn't pump properly, and so patients will almost invariably describe some shortness of breath in that situation. The other information that I had available was an ultrasound of his heart, and this is a very important test to allow us further planning and certainly to rule in or rule out whether there's any structural abnormality, particularly around the mitral valve, which is the valve that controls blood flow out of the left atrium. Essentially, Peter's structure of the heart and function of the heart was relatively normal, but I focused in on this occasion on the size of his atria. It turns out his atria were mildly to moderately dilated, not moderately to extensively, but they were dilated. At this stage, my plan is to bring Peter back with full anticoagulation for at least 4 weeks and really consider whether we should restore sinus rhythm. Sometimes we're caught between trying to restore sinus rhythm and leaving people in atrial fibrillation, and sometimes the lack of symptoms will drive us to simply control rate. In this particular situation though, I'm thinking in the back of my mind that the patient is relatively young, and my observation over the years, and there is some research coming through to support this, is that if we restore sinus rhythm, we may have a positive effect on any morphologic change or structural change the heart could undergo. What I mean by that is that if we leave people in atrial fibrillation for many, many years, we see changes of the heart as a consequence of that atrial fibrillation. The most notable thing is that the atria dilate and enlarge. The other thing that we have seen, and I've got a number of cases where this has occurred, is I believe the ring that connects the atria to the ventricle, the AV ring, over a period of time also dilates as the atria dilates. And if that ring dilates, then the fixtures for the valves that holds, particularly the tricuspid valve, which is on the right side of the heart, can be stretched. And as it gets stretched, the leaves or the cusps of that tricuspid valve don't come together as well. So, although I haven't restored sinus rhythm in Peter yet, certainly it's front of mind when I see him next to think about restoration of normal rhythm to try and maintain the structure of his heart as best as possible in the long term. Regardless of whether I return him to sinus rhythm or not, however, he will be on anticoagulation lifelong now. His CHA2DS2-VASc score is high enough that that's the case, and particularly with him being completely unaware of symptoms, we wouldn't even think to rely on him to tell us when he's in and out of the rhythm. Another interesting case of atrial fibrillation. I hope it gives you something to think about. Thank you for joining me, and good health.
You have been listening to another podcast from Dr. Warrick. Visit his website at drwarrickbishop.com for the latest news on heart disease. If you love this podcast, feel free to leave us a review.